Hey guys, welcome to our 5-minute summary of our last Sunday school lesson. This one is called Solving Biblical Puzzles. And for this one, we're looking at a very familiar story in the Bible and when Jesus called Peter to be a disciple. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at all of the Gospels telling of when Jesus met Peter and just kind of piece those together and try to figure out what exactly is going on. Now, before we do that, we need to talk about the calling of the apostles. Jesus called 12 disciples. He had many disciples, but he's really specified 12 of them to be in his inner circle, and that's going to be who would follow him everywhere he went. But he certainly had many disciples, and a lot of those disciples were probably early disciples of John the Baptist. And so they were following John the Baptist. They were being baptized by him, listening to his teaching, even before Jesus came onto the scene. And so a lot of the disciples of Jesus had been there from the very beginning. Now, how do I know that? Well, if we go to the book of Acts, in the very first chapter of Acts, the disciples needed to pick a new apostle after Judas had died. And so they picked the apostle Matthias. That was going to be their new pick, but he had to satisfy some qualifications first. And the qualifications is that he had to be with the original 12 disciples. This couldn't be just someone brand new to the faith. He had to be there with Jesus and with the other 12. And he had to be there from the very beginning. And so in Acts, it says at the very beginning was the baptism by John the Baptist. So when Jesus was baptized, many of the disciples, if not all of the disciples, were there. They were present. They saw Jesus being baptized, or at least they were nearby, and they were already following John the Baptist. So it's most likely that Peter had met Jesus before Jesus even started his ministry. He was there, if not at the actual baptism, he was there with John the Baptist, and he was there, at least before Jesus had started his ministry. Now, when we go to the four Gospels and we look at this story, and you can read each one of these versions of events, but in Matthew and Mark, very similar stories here. Jesus goes to the Sea of Galilee. He sees the men casting their nets. He calls them fishers of men, and then the four men leave. Andrew, Peter, James and John, they all leave and they follow after Jesus. In Mark, it's very similar, except that after the men leave and follow Jesus, then Jesus goes to Simon's mother-in-law's house and heals her. Now, when we go to Luke, it's a little bit different. So in Luke, the first thing that happens is that Jesus goes to Simon's house, heals his mother-in-law, and then after that, we see him going to Lake Gennesaret, which is also another name for the Sea of Galilee. But when he gets there, he sees them not casting their nets, he sees them washing their nets. So he goes and he sits on the boat while they're washing the nets, and he's teaching the crowd. And then he does this miracle in front of all the men there. He says, "Don't worry, you're going to be catching men from now on." And the four men leave everything. Andrew, Peter, James, and John, they all leave their nets behind and they follow after Jesus. And then when we get to the Gospel of John, it's completely different, just a different story altogether. There's no boat, there's no fishing. This is a story when Andrew meets Jesus for the first time and he spends a day with Jesus. Then he goes and gets his brother Peter and brings Peter to Jesus. Jesus sees him and says, "Look, your name is Simon, but you're going to be called Cephas," which is Peter or the rock. And then Jesus, after he meets Peter, then he starts his ministry in Cana and Jerusalem and Capernaum and all these other places. So these are the four Gospels, and we want to harmonize these. We want to put all of these in sync and figure out what's going on. So I've come up with my own timeline. I call it the Kevin Carden timeline because I don't want to be dogmatic on this. I don't want to say this is exactly what happened, but based on my understanding of the entire New Testament, this is how I piece everything together to satisfy all four Gospels. So first of all, Jesus had to be baptized. That was number one. Jesus had to be baptized. And then right after his baptism, Jesus goes into the wilderness. After he comes back from the wilderness, which was at least 40 days, but it could have been longer. There could have been another amount of time before he comes back. But he comes back to John the Baptist. And when he comes back to John the Baptist, Andrew sees him. Andrew follows Jesus. He spends a day with him. He says, "I've got to go tell my brother about Jesus." And so he brings Simon to Jesus. Jesus meets Simon. He calls him Cephas, which is going to be Peter or the rock. And then after that, immediately after he meets Jesus, after Peter meets Jesus, then Jesus begins his ministry. He goes to Galilee to get more disciples. He goes to Cana to the wedding. He goes to Capernaum. He goes to Jerusalem. He goes to Samaria, etc. Is Peter with them? it's hard to say, but right after Jesus meets Peter for the very first time, Jesus begins his ministry. At some point, John the Baptist is imprisoned. We don't know exactly when that happened, but John the Baptist does become imprisoned, and then Jesus returns to Galilee. When he's in Galilee, he is widely accepted by the people who live there, but he also takes a quick visit to Nazareth, and he teaches there, and he is rejected by his own hometown. After he leaves Nazareth, he goes back to Capernaum, and this is where Simon lives at and Andrew lives at. He goes to the synagogue. He rebukes a demon there. After he does that, he gets a lot of people following him. He goes to Simon's mother-in-law's house. James and John are actually there with him. So Andrew, Peter, James, and John are all at Simon's mother-in-law's house. He heals them, and then after that, the crowds get even larger because they're seeing all of these miracles that Jesus is performing. And then Jesus goes to the Sea of Galilee, which in Luke calls it Gennesaret. And so that's where he goes. He's teaching a crowd there. Andrew and Peter were washing their nets. They were preparing to fish again. So we don't know exactly what time of the day it was, but they weren't fishing at night. The night was already over, and they were washing their nets, fixing their nets, and getting ready for the next night of fishing. Jesus sits on Simon's boat, and he continues to teach to the crowd, and then he stops teaching, and then he talks to Simon, tells him to cast the net into the deep water. Simon does it. There's a miracle that happens. It's a large amount of fish that are in the net. Simon is amazed at this. He tells Jesus to get away from him because he is a sinner and that Jesus is a righteous person. But then James and John, who were in the boat right beside them, they come over and help with the catch. So you have all four men there. Andrew, Peter, James, and John are all there to see this miracle. And then Jesus says, "Do not fear. From now on, you will be catching men." And then all four of them leave everything. This is after the big catch. They follow Jesus, and they're going to follow him with his ministry from that point on. This is my best estimate of what happened with the chronology here of this story. Now, I'm not saying this one is exactly right. I'm very confident this one's right, but there are going to be some issues with this. Number one, there are some apparent contradictions here. So the Gospel of Mark has Jesus going to Simon's mother-in-law's house after the fishing miracle. In Luke, it has the mother-in-law's house is before the fishing miracle. So which order is it? One of those Gospels have to be out of order for this to make sense. Then you also have the washing the nets or casting the nets. That one has to be taken care of. And then you also have the Sea of Galilee, Gennesaret. You have those wordings different as well. So those have to be harmonized, but this is my best attempt to do that. And so I hope that you've been blessed by this. I hope that this helps you to look how to study other stories which are recorded in all four Gospels. But this is what I've got. So I hope that you enjoyed this lesson, and we'll continue with the Gospel of Luke as we continue in Sunday school for next week.